Hello and welcome to EJC News Focus, coming this month from the annual WIN Symposium in Paris. That's WIN, or Worldwide Innovative Networking in Personalised Cancer Medicine. The WIN Consortium was set up in 2010 and it brings together partners from academia, pharma, biotech and the IT industry, all the components needed to deliver the promise of personalised medicine. The consortium, in fact, reached an important milestone earlier this year with the launch of WINTHER, its first clinical trial. At the symposium, I met ASCO's Richard Schilsky and I asked him what the key messages from this symposium are.
I think the key messages are going to be, first of all, personalized medicine for cancer has come of age. We're doing it now routinely in clinical practice. It is complicated. It's going to require that we move away from traditional ways of learning about cancer. One of the challenges of the genetic characterization of cancer is that everything that used to be a common cancer is now becoming a collection of rare cancers, which is going to challenge our ability to do the traditional kinds of clinical trials to develop new therapies in every cancer type. We're going to need to learn more from prospective observational registries and less from clinical trials. And we're going to need to use those registries to observe every clinical encounter with every patient and see what we can learn from that wealth of information that can be generated from all those clinical encounters. I think unless we move in this direction, then we're actually going to slow down in our ability to learn things because we have too many kinds of cancer now with all the genetic characterization of cancer that's going on, too many drugs in development, and not enough patients, not enough time, and not enough money to study everything by doing clinical trials. So we have to come up with alternative ways of getting new information.
Observational studies haven't always been taken that seriously. It would take some courage for researchers perhaps to go back and start doing them again.
Sure. Observational studies historically have been viewed as hypothesis-generating studies, not as definitive studies. Again, I think this is where the big data approaches will be very helpful to us. Making observations in millions of patients should allow us to, sort the signal from the noise more effectively. And hopefully, if we see a consistent signal in large numbers of patients across multiple populations, that will give us more confidence that what we're observing is the reality of the situation. A comment was made earlier today about how we have so highly developed the eligibility for clinical trials, and in a sense so scrubbed clean the population of patients enrolled in clinical trials, that the results of the clinical trials are almost completely no longer applicable to the real-world practice of medicine because there are very few patients that a physician encounters who actually resemble the patients enrolled in the clinical trials. And so, although everyone would still agree that clinical trial evidence is still the highest level of clinical evidence that we can bring to bear on a problem, its applicability, in real-world populations, I think, is actually diminishing over time.
But presumably the clinical researchers can only make these changes if the regulators are on board.
Well, I can't speak for all the regulators in the world. I certainly, I've had a number of interactions with people at the FDA in the US, and I think they are very interested in learning, just as we are, about how to evaluate information that comes to them from a variety of sources. I think it's unrealistic of us in the research and the clinical communities to expect that the regulatory authorities are going to blaze new trails without evidence. And it's up to us to generate the evidence that they need to modify their regulatory positions, to become more forward-thinking. but they have a responsibility, and their responsibility is to ensure that drugs and devices that enter the medical marketplace are safe and effective. And that's sort of the basic responsibility of all regulatory authorities in all regions of the world. Now, there are multiple ways to demonstrate that a product is safe and effective. It doesn't necessarily always have to come from exclusively clinical trial data. And I think that, our jobs in working with them are to develop the kinds of information that they need to inform their regulatory decision-making process. And if we can do that, and we can do that in a convincing way, I think they will change. I think there's ample evidence that they have changed over the years. 20 years ago, the accelerated approval mechanism was developed in the U.S. It's been widely applied in the development of cancer drugs. Now, just last year, the U.S. Congress wrote a new law that gives the FDA authority to develop drugs through what's called a breakthrough designation, and there are already something like 14 or 20 drugs that have received the breakthrough designation. About half of them are cancer drugs, and I think we're going to see through that mechanism the even more rapid development of exciting new cancer therapies, probably with even less requirement for large-scale clinical trials. I think that the drugs that are getting the breakthrough designation generally are highly effective in well-selected patient populations, and I think their safety and efficacy will be self-evident.
Is Europe trailing behind America?
I don't know for sure. I don't think so. I mean, my understanding is that FDA and EMA frequently collaborate, talk often, have regular meetings, and I think the standards that are applied are similar in the two parts of the world. Certainly, there are going to be some cultural differences, but I think not that many. So I think there's certainly much more similarity than difference between those two regulatory authorities.
What practical thing do you expect to come out of this symposium in the short term?
I think what we're learning is that, cancer in a patient is an evolutionary process. The cancer that someone dies from is not the same as the cancer that they were diagnosed with. And that in order for us to optimize the treatment for each patient, that we probably need to be assessing the state of the cancer every time a clinical decision has to be made. Now, right now, that probably involves frequent biopsies. In the future, hopefully, it will involve frequent blood testing or very sophisticated imaging that'll be less invasive for patients. I think in the longer term, we heard some very innovative concepts just presented by Stephen Friend about how we can actually use crowdsourcing of big data to help gain new insights. And I think, as we feel more and more comfortable with getting data out there from a variety of sources and letting all the smart people in the world look at it and develop insights, that will be a long-term, but hopefully very, very sort of practice-changing way of doing things.
So not too long before we see results from this symposium. And with thanks to Richard Schilsky, that's it for this month's EJC News Focus.